Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to be explaining the road to revolution. So we're going to be taking a look at events that pushed the colonies towards breaking free from Great Britain. Keep in mind, not everyone was a patriot at this time. That was actually a relatively small group of people that wanted to break free from England. So as we progress through this video, we are going to see why more and more American colonists wanted to break free. And the first event that really inspired them to be really frustrated with Great Britain was the Proclamation of 1763. Prior to this, Great Britain had been fighting a war with France. France was kind of their number one enemy. And they were fighting both in Europe and in the colonies. And in the colonies, the fight was happening over land. So this land happening kind of in here. And so the French and Indian War was actually Great Britain versus the French and Native Americans. And while there were many British troops that came over and fought in this war, the British also really relied on American colonists to help fight this war. And so for 7 years, American colonists were fighting for land in this French and Indian War, which when Great Britain won, the colonists were really excited to be able to get this land. But then in 1763, King George drew a line down the map and he told the colonists they could not settle past this line. So we're going to watch a video clip here to explain a little bit more about this proclamation.
The year 1763, American colonists had just finished fighting the French and Indian War on behalf of their British overlords. In return, the British gave Americans parcels of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. At first, the Americans were happy, but that would soon change. Here are 5 things that you need to know about the Proclamation of 1763. In the wake of the French and Indian War, a Native American tribal leader named Pontiac was fed up with the British military presence on his land. He and other tribes launched an attack on the British, and fighting continued for the next 3 years. While the British government was already in the process of drafting the Proclamation of 1763, Pontiac's rebellion sped up its enactment. The British needed to find a way to keep Native American tribes happy, so they drew a line that effectively cut off any westward expansion by their colonies. Native Americans would be allowed to keep the area west of the Appalachians, while American colonists had to contain their settlements to the east, rendering their land grants absolutely worthless. Adding insult to injury, any colonists already settled out west were ordered to move. See the problem? The Americans felt the proclamation was unfair, so in many cases, they just ignored it. In a few instances, British soldiers forced American frontiersmen back across the border, sometimes burning their settlements. But for the most part, enforcement was pretty weak, and colonists still sought land across the border, even if that meant breaking the law. French and Indian War hero George Washington was one of the many colonists who flouted the law and sought to purchase as much forbidden territory as possible. In a letter to his real estate agent, he dismissed the Proclamation of 1763 as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. In other words, Washington believed the proclamation would be repealed someday, and when it was, he wanted to already have a claim to this land. One of the unintended but most significant effects of the proclamation was the universal hatred for the British it created throughout colonial America. This is one of the earliest circumstances that created an American identity, because for the first time, the 13 colonies had something in common. The British promised them land, and they didn't get it. If you're looking to find causes for the American Revolution, one of the earliest and least obvious is the Proclamation of 1763.
So that was just giving you really an understanding of why the colonists were starting to get upset. They're kind of smushed onto the coast and they want to move west, but now the king is telling them not to. And so they started to kind of question, is this the king trying to control us? Is he trying to keep us here under his governor's control? And so this is kind of the first thing getting some American colonists to kind of lean towards the Patriots. In 1765, Parliament also passed the Stamp Act. And so for a long time, the colonists were pretty much left alone. They didn't have to pay a lot of taxes. And this is the first time we really see the British government trying to get money out of the American colonists. And really, this comes because they need to pay for the French and Indian War. And so they decide to put a tax on printed documents. This could be legal papers, contracts, bills of sales, licenses, wills, ships papers, advertisements, newspapers, magazines. Pretty much if it was a paper product, you had to then pay a tax for this. And you would see then that the product would be stamped with something like this, showing that you did in fact pay the tax. So again, they needed this in order to pay for the French and Indian War. It was really expensive. That's a 7-year war. Great Britain was in debt, so they needed to raise revenue. And also the concern was they needed more money to pay for protection for the colonists in North America. So part of this money would go to paying for British soldiers to protect them from Native Americans right on that border, and protection within the colonies itself, kind of like police forcing. Colonists started to get upset, though, because they had never had to pay this kind of tax before. This was a new taxation, and it was a taxation on property they were buying. They really hadn't ever had to pay this property tax before. And there was also, they felt like no need for protection. Now that the war was over, colonists were starting to question, why are these British soldiers still here? Again, are they here to spy on us? Are they here to kind of keep us under the government control? Just a lot of mistrust started to happen with this Stamp Act. And they really began to really protest this. In 1767, Parliament passed, again, a new tax upon the colonists, which really led to an act of boycotting goods. Boycott means to refuse to buy or refuse to participate. So the colonists began to boycott. This tax was on glass, paper, lead, and tea. And the reason for it, they said they needed to pay salaries for these royal governors in the colonies. So these are men that King George put in charge in these 13 colonies. Well, this started to make some of the colonists get upset because if you think about it, this tax could mean the governors are being blackmailed. If they start to disagree with Parliament in England or they start to do what the colonists want, then these governors might not get paid. So at the end of the day, the governors are really only going to be listening to the king or Parliament and ultimately not listening to the people. And that's concerning because the colonists were really feeling like their governors are supposed to be representing their interests, and this could possibly keep them from doing so. So again, they started to boycott the Townshend Acts in 1767. Things started to get a lot worse in 1770. This is, of course, the Boston Massacre.
March 5th, 1770. After 3 days of unrest, an angry mob roams the streets. Hundreds of men who lost their jobs and blamed the British gather on King Street and face off against 8 redcoats with orders not to fire. What's about to happen will change America forever. A 17-year-old wigmaker's apprentice, Edward Garrick, lights the fuse. This is how wars start. Private Hugh Montgomery is hit with a club. African-American Crispus Attucks dies instantly. When the smoke clears, 4 more are dead. How Boston reacts will change the course of history.
So the reason these British soldiers were there in Boston is because Boston was really refusing to pay these taxes. Boston had a lot of people that were considering themselves to be patriots. These are people, again, that were getting frustrated with the British government, were angry at this over policing, at these taxes coming in. These customs officials that were checking their ships to make sure that they were shipping the correct things and weren't smuggling in goods. So Boston in particular was very rowdy against the British. So they brought these soldiers in. And of course, this leads to the Boston Massacre, when you have these protesters, screaming at the redcoats, yelling at them, taunting, throwing snowballs, and ultimately it leads to such confusion that the soldiers fire and end up killing these 4 people of the Boston Massacre, and Crispus Attucks, who's also as a part of this. So 5 people end up dead, and this is going to spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. They are going to be informed of this. There's going to be all sorts of propaganda about this, and it's really going to lead to more people becoming patriots. So be sure to check out the next video. It's going to tell you about a couple more events that lead us closer to the revolution. Also, make sure you are filling out this stuff in your notes.